to the Leo Training Podcast with Joe DeLeo. You'll hear in-depth interviews and tips from world-class athletes, coaches, and industry-leading experts to help you train smarter and improve at what you love to do. Train smarter, get stronger, move better, race faster. Here's your host, Joe DeLeo.
We're back with episode 37 of the Leo Training Podcast. And my guest for this episode is Dr. Ed Wittich. Dr. Ed Wittich is the Director of Performance Innovation for BatLogic. Dr. Ed Wittich holds a Doctor of Osteopathy with a Master's in Lower Limb Biomechanics and has a true passion for what makes people perform at their best, which is being injury-free. Ed is the in-house expert for BatLogic and focuses on sports medicine, athlete analysis, and product innovation. He has worked with numerous Olympic teams as well as top colleges and schools internationally and regularly consults around the world. He is also a contributor to international rowing publications and conferences. In this episode, we discuss how technology and equipment has changed over the last half century and how it may be affecting the athlete. We also talk about BatLogic and how the foot stretcher setup takes into account how athletes move, how we want them to generate power from the center out in terms of their body, and how this can play a big factor into rowing biomechanics. One final note before we roll into the episode. Dr. Wittich was gracious enough to come onto the show, and when we recorded the episode, he was actually in his car traveling. So there might be some background noise and the audio might cut out at times. Without further ado, let's roll to episode 37 with Dr. Ed Wittich, BatLogic. Dr. Ed Wittich, welcome to the Leo Training Podcast. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy travel schedule to come onto the show.
No problem, Joe. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure, mate.
Yeah, I'm very excited to have you here. We've got some excellent topics in store for the audience. We're going to be talking about rowing, but we'll be covering some different angles, talking about equipment and technology and kind of where the sport has been and where it's going. But before we get into that, why don't you take a couple minutes, introduce yourself, let the audience know who you are, what you do, and a little bit more about your background.
Sure. Thanks, Joe. Yeah, so I'm the Chief Performance Innovation Consultant at the moment for BatLogic, which is a company that people in rowing would have heard of, but essentially we're a sports innovation company that really looks at the way an athlete integrates with a piece of equipment, the way an athlete functions and moves, and then innovating equipment to make, at the moment, rowing and a range of other sports a lot easier for athletes to achieve performances in, reduce their risk of injury, and then increase the ease of use of whatever that piece of equipment is that they're using. So my background is as an osteopath, essentially a sort of manual practitioner with a big base in anatomy and biomechanics. And then I've gone on and done a master's in lower limb biomechanics, really focused at the way that we can change spinal and pelvic positions with different positions of the feet and the heel in particular. And that's led nicely into the equipment that we're doing with rowing now. I've got a sporting background myself, which is obviously part rowing, but then Australian rules football and swimming. And everyone at BAT either comes from some form of athletic background or sort of sports medicine, sports science. So we hope that we capture a whole range of different fields in what we do.
Excellent. That's really cool. You bring a ton of experience and knowledge from a lot of different areas, so I know that we're going to have some awesome perspective and wisdom to share with the audience.
Super.
So let's kick things off. Let's launch into the first topic. So what we wanted to kind of discuss is looking at rowing equipment, where it's been, how it sort of has come about historically, and then some of the major changes probably over the last 15 to 25 years, and then what you and the team have been doing at BatLogic that has had a big impact in the last few years on performance and injury reduction.
Sure, yeah. I think our sort of start with the whole ideas behind innovating in rowing was that we'd seen the shells themselves change a lot in terms of materials and setup But what we kept coming back to is there hadn't been a lot of innovations over the last 50 years, even 100 years, if you look at the whole history of the sport, around what the athlete integrates with. So the boat shells themselves have obviously changed a lot from kind of your really heavy wooden and metal type setups to obviously very high-tech carbon fibre with a whole range of technologies in there that are really unbelievable, from hydrodynamics to the way that the carbon's actually laid up and put together. And I think that side's been managed especially well. But what we've seen is that the equipment that the athlete's directly touching in terms of sort of foot stretcher, seat, and then the handles of the oars that they're holding, a lot of those things haven't changed very much at all. Of course, we've seen, again, carbon fibre shafts and different blade types come into the sport, and they have affected the way that the athlete moves and applies force. But what we really wanted to focus on is how the athlete actually sets themselves up in the boat. And what we've seen across the history of rowing is performances have, of course, improved with improving equipment, but the injury rate across the sport really hasn't changed. And it's our opinion that we haven't seen a lot of innovations come into the sport that really try and reduce injury risk factors for the rower, directly affect the way that they integrate performance. And that's where we saw a big opening to come in and start looking at some different innovations. At present, we're really focused on the foot stretcher and the feet, but with a view to how that affects the whole body. And of course, the way the body works is everything's linked together. So whenever we affect any part of that chain through the rowing stroke, we're going to see a change through the whole body, be that from the hands, feet, or feet. But we're really focused on things that the athlete's touching, using, and integrating with to produce their performance.
Yeah, that's awesome, and that's one of the things that I really like about the approach that you've taken with the equipment and the research that you've done. Because looking at how the human body and how we transfer force, whether in the rowing stroke, that's to the from the foot stretcher to the oar handle to the face of the blade. But if we were running, it's the transfer of the force is going into ground reaction forces. So kind of taking that whole idea and moving up the kinetic chain. So could you talk a little bit about the research portion that you did that kind of led you to making the adaptations to the foot stretcher and the setup, and how that has brought about greater stability and preventing injuries?
Yeah, definitely. Look, I think it's a bit of a story in terms of the way we started, but we had colleagues and members of Backlogic who'd obviously rowed before and rowed at a very high level, and had a really bad history of back injuries. And for us, with the osteopathic background and being medical practitioners, what we wanted to look at first was actually just the reduction of injury. And so we started looking at factors that could affect lower back pain and lower back risk factors for injury. And we started to research the factors that we really wanted to affect to make some changes there. And what we kept looking at is the fact that the feet, in a lot of cases, were really just not supported with a flat foot stretcher. The foot structure itself, especially in a seated position, it doesn't have any real gravity load through it like it does in a standing position. And what we found is that foot stability played a really important role in setting the athlete up in a strong position to transfer the force that their legs and torso is producing, and also get into a good, strong position during the stroke. So we started testing a range of different applications of the feet to try and increase stability. And one of the things we saw early on was that a lot of athletes weren't really engaging their posterior chain while they produced force through the feet. So a lot of their load was put through just the toes and the ball of the foot. And because of the flat foot stretcher, there often wasn't a lot of heel connection. And once we started looking into that further, we started using heel chocks to try and get the heels loaded earlier, and then using EMG, so electrical firing tests for muscles like the hamstrings and the glutes, to try and see when we changed the foot position, the stability and the heel contact, what effects we could get. And very quickly we saw that once we allowed the athlete to load their heel earlier and in a more stable position, we were seeing increases in the firing engagement of the hamstrings and the glutes, so those posterior chain muscles through the leg and lower body. And then a good change to the firing patterns that actually occurred in those muscles. That was the sort of first breakthrough for us. And then we also did a lot of work looking at the mechanics of how the athlete moves through the stroke. And what we realised is that if we could get the feet again in a stable and well-connected position, the torso was generally more engaged, and the athlete seemed to move with a more consistent movement pattern and be in a stronger position at most phases of the stroke. So it was a lot of work looking at linked anatomy and linked biomechanics, and then positioning the foot in a way to get as much effect as possible. And in the end, what we found was that although we were very focused on injury at the start, engaging those larger muscles has a positive effect on the pelvis and lower back, and it also helps to engage muscles like the lats higher up the chain. But we actually get a significant performance increase as well because, again, they're some of the biggest driving muscles in the body. So we started to kind of broaden what we were looking at, and obviously performance is a lot cooler than injury. So that's what we started to shift our focus to a little. Although, of course, injury and performance really are one and the same thing. So the way we look at it, getting the body set up properly will have a positive effect for both of those factors.
Yeah, I love that. Because your setup. One of the things that we say in Strong First is your setup is your first repetition. If you're doing a lift or an exercise, so taking that sort of that perspective and that emphasis, it's the same thing here. If you're getting the setup correct and the body is in a good position and alignment is there, they're going to be able to not only perform better, but we're going to minimize and mitigate injury risk.
Absolutely. Yep. They're our real keystones for what we're doing.
That's awesome. Now, could you, for those in the audience that may not be familiar, could you kind of shed some light on why increasing muscle activation in the hamstrings and the glutes would transfer to greater stability in the trunk and torso region of the body?
Sure, yeah. So, one of the easiest places to start is even for patients or athletes who've had a back injury in the past and looking at the sort of training in terms of rehabilitation that's often used as a sort of first go-to. And that's really about trying to engage good muscular support through the body. The hamstrings and the glutes are particularly important for the lower back and the pelvis because that's where they really attach. So your hamstrings run up the back of the thigh and actually attach to the bottom of your pelvis. And they invest right into the gluteal muscles, so those big buttocks muscles that you're sitting on every day. All of those muscles are linked in terms of their structure. Again, we need to think of the body as a chain of linked articulations rather than just separate parts. And so if we trace a line up through, even from the foot into the calf, into the hamstring, into the glute, up into the lat, all of those muscles are related in terms of how they attach and their connections of fascia. So fascia is really the wrapping around our muscles that provides strength and tension when we're doing certain movements. And all of those muscles we've just listed are very much linked in terms of how they function together, how they preload the body, and how they provide stability. And so if we can increase the firing of those muscles and increase the pattern of that firing, then we see that the body itself can be a lot more stable and is a lot more effective at transferring and producing force. And they're two really key areas to think about with those muscles because the body produces force with muscle contraction, but it's the transmission of that force through the body and onto the foot stretcher, seat or hand that has a big relation to injury and also how you're going to row the boat as well. So those muscles are really important because they really control the position of the pelvis. They help support the lower back and they allow some preload higher up in the torso to control how, say, the mid-spine is moving and even how the shoulders articulate.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that explanation. So I'll make sure to include maybe a picture from online or Instagram of some of that musculature and perhaps the posterior oblique subsystem, so they can see that sort of fascial connection that you were describing there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, look, the anatomy side, you can go as complex or as light on as you want. I think the most important thing to remember for everyone is that the body is one unit functioning together. And a lot of times people think about injuries in a way where it's sort of, I've got a sore knee and, the problem is just with the knee, when we really know that it's going to affect the whole body. So even forgetting the more complex anatomy side, we just want to focus on understanding that whatever happens at the bottom changes things that happen at the top and vice versa. The body works together.
I love that. That's a huge critical point to drive home there, and I'm so glad that you made it. So kind of segueing from there, what are some differences perhaps in gender as well as demographics, if we're looking from, say, junior to elite to masters rowers, that we should take into consideration, with the foot stretcher setup that BatLogic provides, and then how the pelvis position may be changing as we're going from being a junior athlete all the way up to a masters athlete?
Sure. Look, I think there are some common findings across everyone that we can use as general rules, and one of them is comfort. And comfort is often a really dirty word for performance. There seems to be the perception with a lot of coaches and performance staff that an athlete, if they're performing well, maybe comfort is not such an important factor. But what we really see is that comfort is vital to producing a result from an athlete that's consistent, and having the athlete feel confident and, again, comfortable in their position. So I think you really want to get your athlete comfortable first and foremost, as long as their comfort means they're also then in an effective position. There are a lot of differences, obviously, between a sort of beginner rower, sub-elite, elite, and then masters rower. I think with the younger age rowers that we're seeing, they don't have that harder strength because they haven't done the training load and volume of an athlete that's been training for a long time. So we just want to be careful not to increase the load on those younger athletes too quickly and really gear them too heavily. From the foot stretcher end for us, though, we also want to start putting down some good patterns that they can carry through the rest of their rowing career. So we want to set them up in a position, again, where they can load their heels well, where they're pushing force horizontally as much as possible, and really start getting them into positions where they can move effectively. What we see from the lower back injury point of view is that if the back moves more through the whole stroke cycle, so that's more in terms of flexion, so bending forward, or extension, bending back, the higher range of motion for the spine, the higher the risk of injury. And again, that's something that rings true across all levels of athletes. So we want to teach good basic technique for the junior athletes where they're being very effective using their legs and not moving their spine excessively during the stroke. I think that's an absolute key. As we move up into the elite athletes, then obviously their training volume and load is much higher, and so they can cope with a lot more as well. But what is a real killer at the elite end, and in fact any end for injury risk factors, is really a sudden change to training load or a sudden change to the equipment setup. So we want to make sure that things are consistent for those athletes and any changes are brought in gradually. And from the foot stretcher end, again, we're going to see some pretty high forces on the foot stretcher. So your elite athlete for a heavyweight male is probably going to be loading around 140 kilograms plus of force on the foot stretcher per stroke for the ergo, and between sort of 120, 130 plus in the boat. So that's quite a lot of force that's being pushed. Again, we want them in a stable position, and we want to be looking at things like leg length differences and asymmetries for the athletes as well. So all of that force that's being pushed on the foot stretcher, we want that spread as evenly as possible across the feet. Moving into the masters side, I guess, again, comfort plays a really important role. So we, especially at that level, want to make sure that the athletes are stable in the boat, they're not feeling too tippy, and they can use their muscles to apply force and to load properly rather than trying to hang on to the boat and feel uncomfortable and unstable. And I think you'd asked the question again, sort of different demographics in terms of the female rower to male rower. Generally, I think one of the biggest issues we see with female athletes is a lack of stability for controlling the position of their knee and for their pelvic stability. And that's right across the range from junior athletes to elites to masters rowers. And the really simple example of that is seeing athletes who move their knees in a sort of S shape as they go from catch to finish, or athletes who bring their knees together and then spread them apart through the drive. And that just shows that the body is artificially stabilising their knees, so they can't have their knees tracking straight normally, and the athlete needs to then bring their knees together to feel like they're in a locked-in position. So that's just something from a coaching point of view to look for as well. And often those athletes, again, need either a little more heel load or some training in the gym to try and increase their ability to stabilise their knee and their pelvic levers.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because one of the things I've been researching lately, and it seems to be having a higher and higher prevalence in female rowers, is a higher injury incidence of labral hip tears. And
Yes.
do you see a correlation between greater movement as you described with the knees on the recovery, because the body is trying to find that stability, and that may be playing a factor in the labral tears?
Yeah, I think, it's hard to sort of see. There's obviously anecdotal evidence and then research-based evidence. If we look at the anatomy of it again, really what you've got is the femur moving inside the pelvis and the pelvis moving on top of the femur. So there's two movements that happen there that can compromise the labrum of the hip itself. I think what we want to encourage in all athletes, and something that we don't see done well at a lot of levels, is trying to encourage the pelvis to move as well as the spine. So we want the athlete to have good pelvic movement and good control in the stroke. And what that means is that as the athlete comes up to the catch, we want to see the pelvis tilting forward, and at the back we want to see the pelvis tilting backwards. So we don't just have the spine moving on the hips, and we don't just have the femur itself moving inside the pelvic socket. And what that will do is that spreads the movement then. So again, because the body's all linked, we don't want one part of the body doing more movements than any other. So encouraging good pelvic movement is important. And then good pelvic control is important as well. So we hear a lot of terms thrown around like a lack of pelvic stability. That doesn't mean that you've got this loose hip where everything's moving around. It just means that the control of the athlete isn't maybe at its best. And if we can increase some of that stability, and that does include exercises like strength training and programming proper movement patterns for the athlete as well, generally we see a better pelvic control and a better range of motion through the pelvis will take away some of the risk factors for those hip impingement injuries. And a lot of the time what we see is that an athlete that doesn't have good pelvic motion will find a certain position that works for them with where they hold their hip position, and they'll just continue to use that single movement pattern. And over time, things wear out, and that could increase the risk of them having then a wear and tear injury simply because they've only got one position that they can sit in to move their pelvis through the stroke.
Excellent. Do you have any, exercises that you gravitate towards, on the gym side of things that you, are favorites of yours to help increase, the pelvic stability and the control that you're talking about?
Yeah, look, I think really simple ones is just making sure that whatever you're doing training-wise around the pelvis and those sort of pelvic drivers is that you're remembering to move in multiple planes of motion. So, again, a lot of times with rowing, it's a very sagittal sport where you've just got flexion, extension type movements. And what we want to introduce is athletes who can move well across a range of motions. So, again, the athlete is going to have a focus on rowing, but in everyday life and in rowing, we never move in just one plane of motion. So the things that I like to change up with athletes in the gym is changing foot positions. So the athlete's not always moving with their foot stuck in the same position. And say turning the foot out, turning the foot in, and then also having the foot straight for things like lunges and squats, just giving variable movements for the athlete so they're used to different conditions. Always in the gym especially at an elite end, obviously, we want to be task focused. So whatever we're doing in the gym should have some sort of link to the boat. But those different positions that do help the athlete to cope with things like rough water or changed wind conditions. We want the athlete to be able to move well across a variable amount of movements or positions.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's so important to vary up the type of movements as you described and the foot position, because as I described to you in an earlier call and conversation that you and I had, colleague of ours, Dr. Fiona Wilson made the point to me that the sport, whether you're on the erg or in the boat, the feet are in a very sort of narrow position. Yet when we walk or we're in the gym, we tend to do squats or deadlifts and the feet are shoulder width apart or much wider than what they would be if they were on the foot stretcher.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that we're in a good position where we can now work with boat builders directly around some of these innovation factors for how the athletes are set up in boats. And that's really a recommendation we're trying to make across the sport to get foot stretchers in a slightly wider position. We're always going to be limited by hull size, of course. But there's really no other sort of functional movement, or especially a strength-loaded movement that we do where our feet are locked together like they are in rowing, and especially in the narrower singles and those sorts of boats. It's not really a position conducive to applying force or being comfortable even having the feet sort of right together as they are and trying to load a maximum pushing force, 200 times during a 2K race. So that's absolutely something that we want to have the athlete prepared for, but again, give them a good range of motion through their hips so they can cope with that position.
Awesome. So segueing from there, where do you think, rowing currently stands in really grasping and understanding some of the causes of injuries? Kind of the big three that we talk about a lot are low back, rib, and the one that seems to be coming up more and more is the labral tears. And then how we're doing on the injury rehabilitation front after those injuries have occurred.
Sure. Look, I think depending on which injury you sort of look at, and I'd probably throw knee injuries in there as well as kind of the most common rowing injury, a lot of these ones are very much related again to the way that the athlete controls and transmits their force. I guess how we're doing is a hard question because we see the rates of lower back injury and pain incidences in rowing, in fact, going up, or at least they're not going down. And that's a problem because we've got more technology and more learning and more research than we've ever had, yet we really haven't had a significant impact on those rates. And that's very sad, and that's something that's having an impact on our sport because at the bottom end, and the young end, I should say, children who are getting injured early in the sport are not going to continue the sport. So I think it really gives us a great opportunity to put more emphasis into these areas and try and understand them more and maybe step outside the square of where rowing thinking and rowing research has sort of been and look wider to areas to understand why and how we can have an impact on them. There's a lot of great work being done currently, and as you mentioned as well, Dr. Fiona is doing some fantastic work in the research side of things, and obviously FISA's putting a lot of funding into it because it is an issue in our sport. So there's some great research going on there. We've had some access to research that's been done out of the UK and a lot of research that's been done in Australia. There's a lot of smart people looking at these areas. I think we just want to look at the body again from a wider point of view and start to understand the loads that we're applying to our athletes and why they're continuing to get these injuries. And some things that are very clear at the moment from the research is that, again, that increased motion through the spine alone during the stroke is obviously a big risk factor. And asymmetries through the pelvis and other risk factors. So there's certain things we know that we can tick off now and say, okay, we should avoid these risk factors because the research shows that these do have a bad impact on these areas that are continuing to get injured. I definitely think we need to be conscious of not overloading our athletes, especially at a young age as well. And we need to make sure that they're training again with those different abilities for motion. So 3-degree type training, rather than just training him in those same movements over and over and over again. I think there's some factors that are key. And then long term, again, I guess from our end and what we're really focused on is let's try and understand how the athlete moves, produces force and transmits that force. And let's try and get them set up in a position that's going to support their body structure. Every athlete's different and we need to be cognizant of that fact when we're setting them up in the boat. And from a boat builder point of view, we want to see more adjustability in the boat and simple adjustability so coaches can change the boat easily and quickly for the athlete. And from our end, that's now why we've created a clip-in and clip-out shoe plate pro quick release, because we really wanted to get athletes set up with, first of all, shoe sizes that actually fit them. I definitely don't want to sound like I'm having a dig at rowing now, but there is no other sport on earth where you would jump in and compete in a shoe that doesn't fit you or a friend's shoe that you've borrowed. Again, from my football or swimming background, if someone had asked me to play a match in my friend's boots or even worse, put on my friend's Speedos to swim a 50-metre freestyle race, I just would have left. It would be absolutely ridiculous. Yet in rowing, even from a basic point of view, everyone's probably feeling sick now thinking about sharing their friend's Speedo, but hopefully we can kind of move away from that mental image. In rowing, we're getting girls who are sort of a size 9 to jump into size 15, sometimes 16 shoes, or the vice versa, where you've got a male in a size 13 who's then jumping into a size 10 shoe. that alone is going to have a big impact on back injuries and on performance in the boat. I mean, the feet are, again, producing so much force and moving so much during the stroke that we really want them supported properly. So the simple fact of having a shoe that actually fits you or a setup that can be made specific to your needs, all of those factors will have an impact on the injury side.
Yeah, I love that. So important to take an individualized approach, and we see more and more of that being done on the training side, but now kind of taking it to the next level with the equipment side and really being able to fine tune and dial in the rigging and the foot stretcher, the rest of the equipment to the athlete, and as you said, their structure. And it's amazing not only the carryover that has into the comfort level and performance, but mitigating the risk.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's not something, I mean, we've talked about a lot of kind of complex anatomy and different research ideas. And I completely understand from a coaching point of view that often one of the banes of their existence is time. You know, coaches don't have a lot of time. And so often these sorts of individualized approaches can seem really daunting. But there are some really simple things that you can have set up for your athletes. Again, shoe size, good training practices, good warm-up practices, and good cool-down practices that once they're set, they really don't take much time at all. And hopefully from our side, the equipment innovators side, we can start to create equipment that's really simple and easy and fast to use. We don't want the coaches to be under more pressure and more stress. We do want them to recognise the importance of setting up athletes properly, because that will impact the entire sport from the ground level right up to the elite.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So Ed, we covered all of our topics that we had down. Is there anything that has come to mind sort of over the last 30 minutes that you want to touch on before we kind of move into rapid fire questions?
Yeah, look, I think some of the questions you asked even around research and things are interesting. And I've just been consulting in India actually for the last 2 weeks around some different rowing protocols and programs over there. And they're really trying to grow the sport from sort of a base level to increase the education across the board for all coaches and try and promote the sport itself. And I think get people hungry for understanding more than what they know now. That's going to be a factor that will really help out everyone. From a coaching point of view, if you can understand a little more about the way the body moves and understand a bit more about the injury side. And then from the athlete's point of view as well, understanding a little bit more about your training and kind of what's important and why it should be important. I think knowledge is very powerful in this area. And as knowledge continues to grow, hopefully we get it to a level where it's easily accessible. But the more that you know and the more that you understand, the better your decisions are going to be around training, racing, boat setups, etc. And hopefully, we can be a resource for some of that knowledge, and that's something we'd like to do. At the end of the day, educating people a powerful tool to reduce injury and increase our performance. And then obviously allowing easier setups and easier adjustabilities in the boat. That's a big goal of ours. So hopefully that's what occurs.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And, that's a big reason why I'm doing what I'm doing is to get some of the knowledge of individuals such as yourself out there so that the entire community can benefit from it.
Absolutely. And we'll see not only injuries fall, but the participation rates in the sport go up. That's what we're all about.
Awesome. That's the goal. That's the goal.
Exactly.
All right. So let's move into, rapid fire. All right. So these are just some fun questions I ask each guest. So whatever comes to the kind of the top of your mind.
I know you've said fun, but I'm quite nervous now, I'll be honest. So we'll see how we go.
All right. We'll give it a go. Okay. So Ed, given your current, knowledge level and, experiences, if you could go back in time, what advice would you give yourself 10 years ago?
I'd probably give myself the advice that read even more and go and have more and more experiences. I think I'm very lucky that I've had the ability to travel all over the world looking at different sports, all levels of sports, and a number of very impressive elite sports. And I think the more experiences that you can have, the better. So go out, play more sports, move more, at times even getting injured is actually kind of helpful because you can understand what's happening then when you have a case in front of you. You might have had that injury before, or you understand the feeling that the athlete's having. So experience more. That's what I'd give myself as advice.
Awesome. What is your favorite strength training exercise?
That's a very, very hard question. I'll fudge the answer a little bit. So I'll say any exercise which engages big muscle groups and induces a lot of neural firing. That sounds like a very vague answer, but I think some key ones that are sort of good for rowing, definitely the deadlift is a favourite exercise of mine because I think it really gives you an awareness of body balance, body connection, strength, speed of the lift, and then you're just engaging so many muscles. So I think you can get a lot of bang for your buck from exercises that engage as many muscle groups as possible and have a number of different elements in them around, obviously, the skill of the movement, the muscles involved, the balance of the body, and the feel factor.
Awesome. That's one of my favorites too. How has your training changed today compared to 10 years ago?
Data, I would say. So with the change around medical practices now, we see the term evidence-based medicine sort of thrown around everywhere now, and that's even something that's really moved into the business world as well, where we have the ability now and the capacity to generate a whole lot of data on any metric you can think of and store that data and start analysing it. So there's definitely a lot more data than probably what there was. And now a lot of our practices are being based around data. So there needs to be an evidence for whatever your approach is. The bad side of that, though, is that a lot of the time we generate a lot of data that's really meaningless or it's not useful at the time. And I go back to the coaching question that we were talking about where you've got a time-poor coach. Now, having 10 pages of data for someone like that is actually not useful. So that's something that's definitely changed. I think it will continue to change as the ability to measure has exceeded our understanding at present. And I think once we strip that back a little bit and the understanding matches and the relevance of that data matches up a little better, we'll be in a better place again.
That's very profound. I love what you just said there. Our ability to measure has exceeded our ability to understand.
Yeah.
That's great. Have you ever had an injury? And if so, how did that injury affect your training?
Well, it's funny you should ask. I actually sprained one of my cervical facets this morning doing some overhead military press exercises. I felt pretty pissed off this morning, and I had to stop training. So that was a pretty big impact. I've definitely had a pretty lucky run with injuries. Australian rules footy is a pretty rough sport, and I've been knocked out before and concussed and had broken arms and different bits and pieces. I think every injury, obviously, it affects your training in that you've got to have that rest period, and you've got to modify what you're doing. But in some ways, it also makes you think about your approach, and you learn a lot from it as well. So as much as they're bad and we don't want people to be injured, at least if you are in that position, the learnings from it can be quite helpful. So it's probably affected my mindfulness in the gym, especially in exercise like this morning. I was hurrying. I knew I was time poor, and I wasn't concentrating on good form and technique, and lo and behold, I got injured. So hopefully this is something that's only going to be a 24-hour injury, but already you start to take from that, I should have been concentrating more, I should have been more in the moment, and I should have been looking at my technique a lot more. So hopefully everyone can take that out of the frustration of being injured.
No, that's great advice, and I wish you a speedy recovery. So
thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. So that kind of segues right into the next question is, so what's your best tip to improve recovery from a training session?
Yeah, well, again, I go back to sort of some of the research, and as simple as it sounds, there's a lot of emphasis being put on sleep at the elite level, and giving your body the ability to regenerate and rest. So with a lot of elite programs now, there are really set and structured times around sleep for the athlete. Now, how does that translate into the everyday person or sort of weekend warrior type setup? really, sleep is the time when the body regenerates, when muscles grow, and when a whole lot of systems are reset. You get a lot of neural rest during sleep, and it's just absolutely vital. So I think quality rest and quality sleep is something that's absolutely key to recovery and recuperation. And that can be, if you're busy at work and you've only got a limited time to sleep, that's fine, but you want to try and increase your quality of rest. And you want to try and match your rest with the volume of training. So if your training volume suddenly goes up, you need rest periods then probably more than what you had before to try and allow that recuperation time for your body. And then the second point that I'll add in on that as well is one that can be used for training as well, is that make it specific. So if you're in a rehab phase, what are your goals? What do you actually want to achieve at the end of that rehab period? And make those the absolute center point for everything that you do around your rehab protocol or the practices that you're doing day to day. So even if that's, average Joe who's sprained their ankle and just wants to get back to sort of pain-free walking, great, that's a goal. So focus on that. Or an elite athlete who's had a rib stress fracture who wants to get back to a position where they're, translating their forces more effectively and in a more efficient position for rowing, great, that's your goal. So you want to always have some sort of goal-setting method to approach your rehab.
Excellent. All right. 2 more questions, both easy, much easier than what I've asked so far. So what's your favorite meal?
My favorite meal. I'm a huge fan of Thai food, and so sort of any sort of Thai curry usually gets me going. Or then Indian food as well. I had a pretty good time then in this last little trip, non-stop Indian food. And anyone who hasn't eaten an Indian breakfast, I'd highly recommend it. It's a lot more interesting than toast. So
Awesome. Final question. What's one book everyone should read?
Oh, that's a super question. Very difficult to answer. So I really like reading, and I like reading any sort of book, from sort of your research journals to kind of novels and all the rest as well. I'd say, again, I'm going to fudge an answer here, and you're probably wanting some kind of journal of anatomy or something that can help out everyone. But I would just say is any book that lets you escape is a good book. And whether that's learning or that's just something fun, then, get out there and read something that gives your mind a break. That'll be a good part for your rehab and recovery as well.
Awesome. That's great. I love it. Ed, this has been an honor having you on. I'm glad that we finally got to do it. I know both of us have been traveling, and it's been pretty crazy busy for both of us as things are ramping up for the Rio Olympics. So definitely awesome to have you on, and glad that we got to do it. So thank you so much.
Mate, no, thank you, and great to have the opportunity to talk about, all of what we've talked about today, and good on you for having a whole range of different people involved, mate. That's what we want. We want to look at all different fields and take learnings from everywhere. So really appreciate the time, and I apologise about the time zone. It's not very helpful for you, me living down here in Australia. So appreciate staying up late at night, mate. You need to go to bed.
Yeah, no worries. It's worth it for sure. Definitely get a chance to talk to someone like you and learn a little bit more and pass it on. It's all about helping people get better. So it's been a pleasure. So just hang on the line. Let me give you a proper goodbye, and I'll wrap up the call right now.
No problem.
Thanks for tuning in and listening to this episode of the Leo Training Podcast. If you enjoyed this content, I'd greatly appreciate it if you would take a moment of your time, head on over to iTunes and drop in a 5-star review. Or please share a review or a testimonial on your favorite social media networks such as Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. And be sure to tune in next week with another brand new episode. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to the Leo Training Podcast. Subscribe and get even more expert training tips at www.leotraining.io.